A hand closed over Elena Voss's mouth before she even heard footsteps behind her. 1 second, she was walking to her car after a 12-hour shift at the hospital, keys ready between her fingers, the way her mother taught her. And the next second, the world tilted sideways. Her back hit a hard chest. A cloth bag came down over her head. She screamed into a gloved palm, and the sound died before it left her throat. "Get her in the car," a voice said. Calm, almost bored, like this happened every day. Elena kicked. Her heel connected with something solid, a shin maybe, and a man grunted behind her, but the grip on her arms did not loosen. She was lifted clean off the ground, carried like a piece of furniture, and thrown onto a seat that smelled like leather and cigarette smoke. A door slammed. Locks clicked down all around her. She yanked at the bag over her head, and someone let her. It fell away, and she blinked into the dim interior of a car, moving fast through streets she did not recognize. 2 men sat across from her, both dressed in dark suits, both looking at her like she was a package that needed delivering, not a person. "Where are you taking me?" Her voice cracked on the last word. She hated that it cracked. Neither man answered. The one on the left checked his phone. The one on the right watched her with flat, uninterested eyes, the kind of eyes that had seen frightened people before, and stopped caring what happened to them. "I have money," Elena said, even though she barely had $500 in her savings account after paying rent. "Whatever this is, you have the wrong person. I'm a nurse. I don't have anything you want." "Save it," the man on the left said without looking up from his phone. The car took a sharp turn, and Elena's shoulder slammed into the door. Pain bloomed hot and sudden, and for a moment, she thought she might be sick right there on the expensive leather seats. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window instead, forcing air into her lungs, forcing her mind to work instead of panic. Think, remember details, street signs, landmarks, anything. But the windows were tinted so dark that the city outside looked like it was drowning in ink, and she could make out nothing beyond vague shapes of buildings sliding past. The drive lasted maybe 20 minutes, though it felt like hours folded on top of each other. When the car finally stopped, the door on her side opened, and a hand closed around her upper arm, pulling her out onto gravel. Cold night air hit her face. She looked up and saw a house that did not belong in this city. A house too large and too clean and too guarded, with men standing at intervals along a stone wall like statues that happened to carry weapons. "Move," the man beside her said, and pushed her forward. Elena's legs shook with every step up the wide front stairs, but she kept her chin up. She had learned a long time ago, in emergency rooms full of screaming and blood, that panic did nothing except make things worse. Whatever this was, whoever these people were, falling apart would not help her survive it. The doors opened into a hallway lit by low golden light, and the man walking beside her steered her through it, past closed doors, past a curved staircase, until they reached a large room with a fireplace and dark wood furniture, and a man standing near the window with his back to her. He was tall. That was the first thing she noticed, even in her fear, even with her heart slamming against her ribs. He wore a dark shirt with the sleeves rolled to his forearms, and there was something in the set of his shoulders that told her this was not a man used to being questioned. "Boss," the man beside Elena said, "we got her." The man at the window turned around. Elena's breath caught. He was younger than she expected, maybe early 30s, with dark hair, and a face that would have been handsome anywhere else, under any other circumstances. But his eyes were the coldest thing she had ever seen, gray and sharp, and they moved over her the way a buyer might look over livestock. Then those eyes narrowed, and something shifted in his expression. "That's not her," he said. The room went very still. "Boss?" the man beside Elena said again, uncertain now. "I said that's not her." His voice had dropped low, dangerous. He crossed the room in a few long strides and stopped in front of Elena, studying her face like he was searching for a mistake he refused to believe he'd made. "The woman you were supposed to bring me has black hair down to her waist and a scar above her left eyebrow. This is not that woman." Elena's pulse hammered so hard she could hear it in her ears. "I told them," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I told them in the car, you have the wrong person. My name is Elena Voss. I'm a nurse. I was walking to my car after work, and your men grabbed me off the street like I was nothing." The two men who had brought her exchanged a look that told Elena everything she needed to know. They had made a mistake, and mistakes in this house were clearly not taken lightly. "She was coming out of the same building," one of them said quickly. "Same time, similar height. We thought—" "You thought." The man's voice cut through the room like a blade. "Do you understand what you have done? Do you understand what happens now?" Silence answered him. He turned back to Elena, and for a long moment he simply looked at her, his jaw tight, his eyes doing that same searching thing again, like he was trying to solve a problem she could not see. Elena forced herself to hold his gaze, even though every instinct in her body screamed to look away, to make herself smaller, to disappear. "You're frightened," he said finally. It was not a question. "Yes," Elena said. "Because I was kidnapped off the street by men with guns and brought to a house I don't recognize, and I still don't know what's happening or who you are." Something flickered behind his eyes. Surprise, maybe. People probably did not talk to him this way very often. "My name is Dante Marchetti," he said, "and you are correct. My men made an error. You should not be here." "Then let me go." The words rushed out of her, hope rising fast and desperate. "Please, I won't tell anyone. I don't even know where I am. Just let me go home." Dante did not answer right away. He turned from her and walked back toward the window, looking out at the darkness beyond the glass, his hands clasped behind his back. The silence stretched long enough that Elena began to wonder if he had forgotten she was standing there at all. "It is not that simple," he said eventually. "Why not?" Elena's voice rose, panic finally breaking through the composure she had been holding onto by threads. "You just said it yourself. Your men made a mistake. I'm not who you wanted. There's no reason to keep me here." "There is a very good reason." He turned to face her again, and his expression had shifted into something unreadable, something careful. "You have now seen this house. You have seen my face. You know my name. If I let you walk out that door tonight, you become a woman who can point the police toward things I cannot allow to become public. That is a problem I did not have an hour ago, and it is a problem I need time to think through." Elena's stomach dropped. "I wouldn't tell anyone. I swear it. I just want to go home." "Everyone says that," Dante said quietly, "right up until they don't mean it anymore." He gestured toward the two men who had brought her, and Elena flinched at the movement, bracing for something terrible. Instead, his voice came out clipped and businesslike. "Take her upstairs, the room at the end of the East Hall. Nothing happens to her. Do you understand me? Nothing. If either of you so much as raises your voice at her again, you will answer to me personally." The men nodded, tension easing slightly from their shoulders, though Elena's own tension only climbed higher. "Wait," she said, as one of the men reached for her arm. "You can't just keep me here. This is kidnapping. This is a crime. People will look for me. My roommate will call the police the second I don't come home." Dante studied her again, and this time, there was something almost like respect in the way he looked at her, buried under the coldness. "I don't doubt that you're right," he said, "and I will deal with that. But tonight, you stay here, where I know you're safe, until I decide what to do next." "Safe?" Elena repeated, an edge of disbelief in her voice. "You think this is safe? Safer than the alternative," Dante said, and something in his tone told her the conversation was over. The man beside her took her arm again, gentler this time, and led her out of the room. Elena looked back once, and found Dante still watching her, his expression unreadable in the low light, his eyes tracking her until she disappeared around the corner. The room they brought her to was nothing like she expected. No bars on the windows, no chains, no bare mattress on a cold floor. It was a proper bedroom, with a large bed dressed in soft gray linens, a window that looked out over a dark garden, and a door that led to a private bathroom. The man who walked her there said nothing as he pulled the door shut behind him, and Elena heard the unmistakable click of a lock turning from the outside. She crossed the room in 3 quick steps and tried the window. It opened, but only a few inches, stopped by some kind of security latch she could not force loose no matter how hard she pulled. Beyond the glass, she could see the stone wall at the edge of the property, and the shapes of armed men still moving along it in slow, patient circles. There would be no climbing out, no easy escape. Elena sank down onto the edge of the bed, her hands shaking now that there was no one left to perform calm for. She thought of her roommate, Maddie, who would be expecting her home in an hour, who would start calling her phone when she didn't show, who would eventually call the police when those calls went unanswered. She thought of her patients at the hospital, the ones she had promised to check on first thing in the morning. She thought of her mother, 3 states away, who called every Sunday like clockwork, and would panic completely if that call ever went unanswered. She had walked out of a hospital shift like she had 1,000 times before, tired and thinking about nothing more complicated than what to eat for dinner, and somewhere between the parking lot and her car, her entire life had been picked up and set down somewhere else entirely. A soft knock came at the door sometime later, though Elena had lost track of exactly how much time had passed. She did not answer it, curled tight on top of the covers, still fully dressed, still braced for something terrible to happen. The door opened anyway, and a young woman stepped inside carrying a tray, her eyes darting nervously around the room, like she was not entirely comfortable being there either. "I brought you food," the woman said, setting the tray on a small table near the window. "Mr. Marchetti said you should eat something." "I'm not hungry," Elena said, though her stomach had been growling for the last hour, betraying her. The woman hesitated by the door, glancing back at Elena with something that looked almost like sympathy. "For what it's worth," she said quietly, "he doesn't usually go to this much trouble for people he plans on hurting." Before Elena could ask what that meant, the woman had slipped back out, and the lock clicked into place once more. Elena sat alone in the quiet room, staring at the tray of food she had no intention of touching, and tried to make sense of a night that refused to make any sense at all. Somewhere below her, in that room with the fireplace, a man with cold gray eyes was deciding what to do with a life he had taken by mistake, and Elena understood, with a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room, that her fate now rested entirely in his hands. She did not sleep. She sat by the window instead, watching the guards pace their slow circles along the wall, watching the dark garden do nothing at all, and waiting for morning to bring some kind of answer. It was well past 3 in the morning when she heard footsteps stop outside her door. Not the heavy, careless steps of the men who had carried her from the car, but slower, more deliberate ones. She held her breath, waiting for the lock to turn, but it never did. Whoever stood on the other side of that door simply stayed there, motionless, for what felt like a very long time, before finally walking away again. Elena did not know it yet, but Dante Marchetti had stood outside that door for nearly 10 minutes, his hand resting against the wood, trying to decide whether to knock. He had made mistakes before in his line of work. He had corrected them quickly, efficiently, without a second thought. But something about the wrong woman his men had dragged into his house tonight refused to leave his mind, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Dante found himself unable to make a decision that should have been simple. Let her go, and risk everything she now knew about him. Or keep her close, and risk something he did not yet have a name for. He walked away from her door without knocking, but he did not sleep that night either. Downstairs, in the study with the fireplace, Dante poured a drink he did not touch, and stared at the dying flames until they turned to embers. His second in command, a broad-shouldered man named Victor Calloway, found him there just after 4 in the morning, still in the same clothes, still awake. "You should rest," Victor said, closing the door behind him. "Whatever you decide about the girl, will still need deciding in a few hours." "I know exactly what needs to be done," Dante said, though his voice lacked its usual certainty. "Find out everything about her, where she works, who she lives with, whether she has family who will come looking too fast. I want to know if she is a threat before the sun comes up." Victor studied him for a long moment. He had worked beside Dante for almost 10 years, long enough to recognize the difference between his boss thinking through a problem and his boss avoiding one. "You could have let her go the moment you realized the mistake," Victor said carefully. "Paid her off, made her disappear from the story before it even started. Instead, you sent her upstairs with a locked door and a guard outside it. That is not how you usually handle loose ends." "She is not a loose end," Dante said sharply, then seemed to hear his own words and paused, frowning at the fire as though it might explain his sudden defensiveness. Victor said nothing, but the look on his face made it clear he had noticed exactly what Dante had noticed about himself, and neither of them had a comfortable answer for it. "Get the information," Dante said again, standing and turning away from the fireplace. "By morning, I want to know everything about Elena Voss before I decide what happens to her." Victor nodded once and left the room, and Dante found himself alone again with nothing but the dying fire and the strange, unfamiliar restlessness that had settled into his chest the moment he'd looked into a stranger's frightened eyes and found something there that refused to let him look away. Upstairs, Elena finally gave in to exhaustion sometime near dawn, though her sleep was thin and full of jolts, her body flinching awake every time the house creaked or a floorboard groaned somewhere down the hall. When she opened her eyes for good, gray morning light was filtering through the window, and for one confused, hopeful moment, she thought she might be in her own apartment, that the entire night had been some terrible dream conjured by exhaustion after a long shift. Then she saw the unfamiliar ceiling, the unfamiliar furniture, the tray of untouched food still sitting on the table by the window, and the memories crashed back over her all at once. She sat up fast, heart pounding, and went straight to the door, pressing her ear against the wood. She could hear faint movement somewhere in the house below, muffled voices, the distant sound of a door closing. She tried the handle out of habit more than hope, and found it still locked. A different young woman came by an hour later, this one older, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner, carrying a fresh tray and a folded set of clothes. "Mr. Marchetti thought you might want to change," the woman said, setting both down without waiting for permission. "There's a bathroom through that door, if you'd like to freshen up. I'll be right outside if you need anything." "I need to go home," Elena said, watching the woman's face carefully for any reaction. "That's what I need." The woman's expression softened, just slightly, but she said nothing, and a moment later she had let herself out, the lock clicking into place behind her once more. Elena forced herself to eat a little that morning, if only because she suspected she would need her strength for whatever came next. The clothes left for her fit almost perfectly, which unsettled her more than she expected. It meant someone had studied her closely enough overnight to guess her size correctly, and that small, precise detail made the whole situation feel even more deliberate, even more inescapable. Around midday, footsteps approached her door again, heavier this time, and the lock turned before anyone knocked. Elena stood quickly, bracing herself, and found Dante standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable, a folder tucked under one arm. "We need to talk," he said. "Finally," Elena said, crossing her arms even though her hands were shaking. "Have you decided to let me go?" Dante stepped into the room and closed the door behind him, though he made no move to lock it this time. He set the folder down on the small table, and Elena caught a glimpse of her own name printed across the top of the first page inside. "I know where you work," he said quietly. "I know your roommate's name is Maddie Ellison, and that she already called your phone 6 times last night when you didn't come home. I know your mother lives out of state and calls you every Sunday. I know a great deal about your life now, Elena Voss, and none of it tells me you deserve to be caught in the middle of mine." Elena's chest tightened at the sound of Maddie's name in his mouth, proof that her world outside this house was still spinning without her, worried and searching. "Then let me go back to it," she said. "Please." Dante was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes moving over her face again, searching for something Elena could not name. "It is not as simple as walking you to the front door," he said finally, "but I give you my word, Elena. I did not bring harm to you last night, and I do not intend to start now. Whatever happens next, you will not be hurt in this house." It was not the answer she wanted, it was not freedom, but something in the steady weight of his voice made her believe, against every instinct telling her not to trust a man who kept her locked behind a bolted door, that he meant exactly what he said. For the first time since the cloth bag had come down over her head, Elena allowed herself to breathe a little easier, even as the locked door behind Dante reminded her that easier was still a very long way from safe. The guard outside Elena's door had a habit of checking his phone every few minutes, and by the third day, Elena had counted exactly how long each check lasted. 40 seconds, sometimes a full minute if a message came through. Long enough, she had decided, to slip past him if she timed it right. She had spent 2 days pretending to accept her situation, eating the meals brought to her, answering questions with short, defeated sentences, letting the guards believe she had given up. It was the same trick she used with frightened patients in the emergency room, the ones who needed to believe a situation was under control before they would let their guard down enough to be helped. Except this time, she was the one who needed someone to let their guard down. On the third afternoon, when the young guard named Carlo pulled out his phone and started typing with both thumbs, laughing quietly at something on the screen, Elena eased her door open the few inches the hinges would allow without a sound. He did not look up. She counted her breaths, watched him for one more moment, then slipped past him into the hallway and moved fast toward the staircase at the far end. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat, but she kept her steps light, hugging the wall, passing closed doors she did not dare try. The staircase came into view, and beyond it, faintly, she could see a sliver of daylight where a side door stood slightly open, probably for deliveries. She was 3 steps from the bottom of the staircase when a voice stopped her cold. "Going somewhere?" Elena froze. Dante stood in the doorway of the study, a glass of water in his hand, watching her with an expression that was somehow both amused and unimpressed at once. "I was looking for a bathroom," she said, the lie sounding weak even to her own ears. "There's one in your room," Dante said. He set the glass down on a side table and walked toward her, unhurried, like a man who already knew exactly how this conversation would end. "Carlo is going to have an unpleasant conversation with me later about checking his phone on duty, but you already knew that, didn't you? That's why you waited for it." Elena's jaw tightened. There was no point denying it now. "You can't blame me for trying." "I don't blame you at all," Dante said, stopping a few feet away from her, close enough that she had to tilt her head slightly to hold his gaze. "I would try too, in your position, but I would also tell you that the wall around this property is 11 feet high, the gate only opens for cars with the correct code, and every man patrolling it has been doing this job a great deal longer than you have been planning your escape from a locked bedroom. So I should just give up," Elena said, bitterness sharpening her voice. "Sit quietly in my cage until you decide what to do with me." Something flickered across Dante's face at the word cage, something that looked almost like it stung. "That is not what this is. It's exactly what this is." Elena took a step closer, anger finally overtaking the fear that had kept her quiet and compliant for 2 days. "You locked me in a room. You have men watching my door. I didn't do anything wrong. I was walking to my car after a 12-hour shift, and now I don't know if I'll ever see my family again. So forgive me if I don't care how tall your wall is." Dante did not answer right away. He studied her, the same searching look from that first night, and Elena had the strange sensation of being read like a chart, every vital sign examined and recorded. "You're not wrong to be angry," he said finally, quieter now. "Walk with me. I'm not interested in a tour." It wasn't a request born from politeness, Dante said, though something in his tone had softened. "Consider it an alternative to being carried back to your room by Carlo, who is currently very eager to make up for his mistake." Elena glanced past him and saw the young guard hovering near the bottom of the stairs, red-faced and clearly terrified of what his lapse might cost him. Against every instinct telling her to refuse, she found herself falling into step beside Dante instead, if only to buy herself more time outside the 4 walls that had become her entire world. He led her not toward the front door, as she had half hoped despite herself, but through a side hallway that opened into a garden she had only seen from her window. Late afternoon sun slanted through the trees, and for a moment, Elena simply breathed the fresh air, tipping her face up toward the sky like she had forgotten what it felt like to stand beneath open air instead of a locked ceiling. "This is where my mother used to grow roses," Dante said, nodding toward a row of thorny bushes along the far wall, mostly wild now, tangled and overgrown. "She died when I was 16. No one has kept up with them properly since." Elena glanced at him, surprised by the sudden, unprompted piece of himself he had offered. "Why are you telling me this?" "I don't know," Dante admitted, and for the first time since she had met him, he sounded almost uncertain. "Perhaps because you looked like you needed a reason to stop being afraid of me for 5 minutes." "I have plenty of reasons to be afraid of you," Elena said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier edge. "You had me kidnapped." My men did, Dante corrected. A mistake I have not stopped thinking about since it happened. They walked in silence for a while, the gravel path crunching beneath their feet, guards keeping a respectful distance at the edges of the garden. Elena found herself studying him sideways, trying to reconcile the cold, commanding man from that first terrifying night, with the quieter figure walking beside her now, hands in his pockets, shoulders less rigid than she had first seen them. "Why haven't you let me go?" she asked finally. "You know I'm not a threat to you. You've had 2 days to figure that out." Dante was quiet for several steps before answering. "Because the moment you leave this house, you become a variable I cannot control. A frightened woman who was taken against her will has every right to go to the police, to tell them everything she saw, everything she heard. I cannot fault you for that. But I also cannot allow it, not yet. Not until I understand exactly what letting you go will cost me." "So it's not about me at all," Elena said, something in her chest sinking despite herself. "It's about protecting yourself." "It started that way," Dante said, and he stopped walking, turning to face her fully. "I will not pretend otherwise. But somewhere in the last 2 days, it became something else, and I find that far more difficult to explain." Elena's breath caught, and she hated herself a little for the way her pulse quickened at his words, instead of spiking with fear. "That doesn't change anything," she said, though her voice had lost its conviction. "You still locked me in a room. You still have men guarding my door." "I know," Dante said simply, "and I understand, if that is unforgivable to you." They stood there in the fading light, neither of them speaking, the space between them charged with something neither seemed willing to name. Elena looked away first, staring hard at the overgrown roses, instead of the man in front of her, trying to remember why she was supposed to hate him, trying to remember that pity for a lonely man with dead parents did not erase the fact that she was still, in every legal sense, his prisoner. "I want to call my roommate," she said instead, forcing her voice back into something steady. "Just to tell her I'm alive, she must be terrified." Dante considered this for a long moment, and Elena could see him weighing the risk against something else, something that looked almost like guilt. "One call," he said finally. "Supervised. You tell her you are safe, and that you need time before you can explain further. Nothing more." It was not everything Elena wanted, but it was more than she expected, and for the first time since the cloth bag had come down over her head 3 days ago, she felt something close to hope settle in her chest. That evening, in the study with the fireplace, Dante held the phone while Elena spoke to a frantic, tearful Maddie, her friend's voice cracking with relief and fear and confusion all tangled together. Elena kept her sentences careful, vague, promising she was unharmed, promising she would explain everything soon, watching Dante's face the entire time for any sign she had said too much. He never once reached to end the call early, never once looked anything but patient. And when Elena finally hung up, her eyes wet with tears she had been holding back for days, Dante simply handed her a handkerchief from his pocket and said nothing at all. "Thank you," Elena whispered, and meant it more than she wanted to. "You're welcome," Dante said quietly, and for a moment, standing together in the low firelight, the space between captor and captive felt thinner than either of them was prepared to admit. Later that night, as Elena lay in the unfamiliar bed listening to the guards change shifts outside her door, she found herself replaying the walk through the garden over and over, the way Dante's voice had softened when he spoke about his mother, the way his eyes had held hers like she mattered more than the danger she represented to his world. She told herself it meant nothing, that it changed nothing about the locked door or the armed men outside it. But some quiet, traitorous part of her had already stopped believing that entirely. The next morning brought a different kind of tension to the house. Elena woke to raised voices carrying faintly up through the floorboards, and when the older woman, whose name she had learned was Priya, brought breakfast, she moved with none of her usual calm efficiency, her hands trembling slightly as she set the tray down. "Is everything all right?" Elena asked. Priya hesitated at the door, glancing back once. "There's trouble downstairs. Nothing you need to worry about." But Elena did worry, because the raised voices did not fade, and because when Priya left, she forgot to turn the lock all the way, the mechanism catching, but not clicking into its final position. Elena noticed immediately. She sat very still for several minutes, staring at the door, weighing the risk of testing it against the very real possibility that whatever crisis had gripped the house below might work in her favor. Curiosity, and something sharper than curiosity, finally won. She eased the door open and slipped into the hallway, moving toward the sound of voices, instead of away from them this time, telling herself she only wanted to understand what was happening, though some part of her already suspected the truth had something to do with her. She found a narrow servant staircase near the end of the hall, the kind built into old houses for staff to move unseen between floors, and followed it down until the voices grew sharp and clear. "Cannot keep pretending this will simply resolve itself," a man's voice was saying, tight with frustration. Elena recognized it as Victor, the broad-shouldered man she had seen once in passing. "Marchetti, the Callahans know you took the wrong woman. Word is already moving through the families. They are asking why you are protecting a nurse who means nothing to you, instead of correcting your mistake and moving on." "I am aware of what they are asking," Dante's voice answered, low and controlled, though Elena could hear the strain beneath it. "Then answer me honestly," Victor pressed. "What exactly are you planning to do with her?" There was a long pause. Elena pressed herself against the wall of the narrow staircase, barely breathing, straining to catch whatever answer came next. "I don't know yet," Dante finally said, and something in his voice sounded almost like a confession torn out of him against his will. "I know what I should do. Pay her enough to guarantee her silence, arrange transportation somewhere far from here, and never think of her again. That is what I would have done a week ago, without hesitation. And now?" Another pause, longer this time. "Now I find myself inventing reasons to walk past her door twice a day." Elena's heart slammed against her ribs so hard she was certain the men below must be able to hear it. She had suspected, in the vague, half-formed way a person suspects things they are afraid to name directly, that something had shifted between them in that garden. Hearing it confirmed, spoken aloud in his own voice to another man, made it impossible to keep pretending otherwise. "That is a dangerous thing to admit," Victor said quietly. "Especially now. The Callahans are not going to let this go. If they learn you have feelings for the woman your men took by mistake, they will see it as a weakness to exploit, not a mistake to forgive." "I know exactly what they will see it as," Dante said, his voice hardening again, the vulnerability sealing itself back behind something colder and more familiar. "Which is precisely why nothing about this leaves this room." Elena did not wait to hear more. She retreated back up the narrow staircase as quietly as she had come, her mind spinning, her chest tight with something she refused to call excitement, even as her body betrayed her with a racing pulse and warm cheeks. She slipped back into her room and pulled the door shut behind her, leaning against it, trying to steady her breathing before anyone noticed she had ever left. She had come downstairs looking for information about the danger surrounding her. Instead, she had found something far more complicated and far more dangerous to her own careful composure than any threat from outside the walls of this house. An hour later, footsteps stopped outside her door, and this time the lock turned properly. Dante stepped inside, his expression giving away nothing of the conversation she had overheard, though Elena searched his face for any trace of it anyway. "I need to ask you something," he said, "and I need you to answer honestly." "That depends on the question," Elena said, proud of how steady her voice came out, despite the storm still turning over inside her chest. "Has anyone approached you, spoken to you about matters outside this house? A name, perhaps?" "Callahan." Elena kept her expression carefully blank, grateful in that moment for years of practice, keeping her face calm in front of frightened patients and grieving families. "No one has spoken to me about anything except meals and locked doors," she said. "Why? Should I be worried about someone named Callahan?" Dante studied her for a long moment, and Elena held perfectly still under the weight of it, certain he could see straight through her carefully composed lie. But whatever he was searching for, he did not seem to find it, and after a moment, some of the tension eased from his shoulders. "No," he said finally, "you should not be worried about anything. That is my responsibility now, not yours." He turned to leave, then paused at the door, glancing back at her with an expression she could not quite read. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, I am sorry for what my mistake has cost you already. And I intend to make certain it does not cost you anything more. He left before Elena could respond, the lock clicking shut behind him, and Elena sank down onto the edge of the bed, her mind racing through everything she had heard, everything she now understood about the danger closing in around this house, and the strange, unwanted realization that some quiet part of her wanted to protect the very man responsible for taking her freedom in the first place. The television in the study was showing Elena's own face when she walked past the open door on her way back from the garden, and she stopped so suddenly that the guard behind her nearly collided with her shoulder. "Turn that off," Dante's voice snapped from inside the room, but it was too late. Elena had already seen the headlines scrolling beneath her photograph, the same photograph from her hospital identification badge, grainy and unflattering, and unmistakably her. Local nurse missing, family demands answers. "Wait," Elena said, pushing past the guard into the study before anyone could stop her. "That's me. That's my picture. Why is this on the news?" Dante stood near the fireplace, jaw tight, watching her with an expression that told her this was exactly the conversation he had been trying to avoid. Victor sat in a chair nearby, a tablet in his hands, scrolling through something with a deep frown carved into his face. "Someone leaked your disappearance to the press," Dante said finally, "which means someone wanted your face in the news, and someone wanted questions, asked about who might have taken you." "The Callahans," Elena said, before she could stop herself, and immediately regretted it as both men turned sharp eyes toward her. "How do you know that name?" Dante said, his voice gone very quiet and very dangerous. Elena's mind raced, weighing the cost of admitting she had overheard him days ago against the cost of lying badly to a man who seemed to see through everything. "I heard you and Victor talking," she admitted. "The lock didn't catch properly one morning. I wasn't trying to spy. I just wanted to know why everyone downstairs sounded so afraid." For a moment, no one spoke. Victor's frown deepened, and he shot Dante a look that clearly said this was exactly the kind of complication he had warned about. Dante, however, simply studied Elena with something that looked almost like reluctant respect. "Then you already understand the situation is worse than you thought," he said. "The Callahan family is a rival organization. They believe I took their associate's daughter as leverage in an ongoing dispute. When they discovered I had taken the wrong woman entirely, they saw an opportunity, rather than a mistake, to be corrected quietly." "An opportunity to do what?" Elena asked, though some part of her already dreaded the answer. "To make me look reckless," Dante said. "Unstable. A man who kidnaps innocent civilians off the street is not a man other families want to do business with. If the police begin investigating your disappearance and trace it back to my organization, it damages everything I have built, everything my father built before me. The Callahans do not need to hurt you to hurt me. They only need the world to believe I already have." Elena sank into the nearest chair, her legs suddenly unsteady beneath her. "So this is my fault too now, being on the news." "None of this is your fault," Dante said, his voice sharpening with something that sounded almost protective. "None of it. You did nothing except leave work at the wrong moment, and every consequence since then belongs to the men who made the mistake and the men trying to profit from it." Victor cleared his throat from his chair, drawing both their attention. "There is more," he said carefully. "The Callahans have people watching this property. We spotted a car near the north gate twice this week, same plates, same driver. They are not simply spreading rumors. They are gathering information, waiting for an opening." "What kind of opening?" Elena asked. "The kind where they take something of mine," Dante said grimly. "The same way I appeared to take something of theirs. It would be a fitting response, from their perspective, poetic even." The room fell silent, as the weight of his words settled over all three of them. Elena thought of the locked door, the guards outside it, the 11-foot wall Dante had described in the garden days ago, and understood with sudden, sickening clarity that the same precautions meant to keep her contained were now the only things standing between her and a danger far worse than anything Dante himself represented. "Then let me go," Elena said, though her voice lacked the conviction it had carried the first time she'd said those words. "If I disappear from this house, if I go somewhere they can't find me, doesn't that solve everyone's problem? You're not protecting anything by keeping me here anymore. You're making me a bigger target. That is precisely why I cannot let you go, Dante said. Not now. If the Callahans believe you hold value to me, releasing you into the world unprotected hands them exactly the opportunity Victor described. Here, at least, I can guarantee your safety. Outside these walls, I can guarantee nothing. You can't guarantee it in here either, Elena shot back, fear sharpening into anger. You just said they're watching the property. What happens if they decide waiting isn't worth it anymore? Dante crossed the room and knelt slightly, so he was level with her, his gray eyes steady and serious, in a way that momentarily stole the anger right out of her chest. Then they will have to go through every man on this property, and through me before they reach you, he said. I give you my word on that, Elena. Whatever else you believe about me, believe that. Something in his voice, low and certain, settled over Elena, like a hand pressed flat against her racing heart. She wanted to argue further, wanted to remind him that his word had already cost her freedom once, but the fear in the room had shifted from something abstract into something with a face and a license plate, and she found she no longer had the strength to keep pushing him away. Over the following days, the house changed around her. More guards appeared along the walls. The gate opened less frequently, and when it did, cars were searched twice before being allowed through. Elena noticed Dante grew shorter with his men, sharper in his instructions, though he never once raised his voice at her, not even when she pushed back against decisions she disagreed with. One evening, she found him alone in the study, long after most of the house had gone quiet, staring at a folder spread open across the desk, papers covered in names and addresses she did not recognize. You should be resting, he said without looking up, though something in his voice told her he was not entirely surprised to find her there. So should you, Elena said, stepping further into the room. You've barely slept since the news broke. I sleep when the house is secure, Dante said. Right now, it is not. Elena moved closer, glancing down at the papers scattered across the desk, at the careful, methodical notes in his handwriting, mapping out something that looked disturbingly like a plan for war. Is this about the Callahans? It's about making sure they understand. Attacking this house costs more than they are willing to pay, Dante said, finally looking up at her. His eyes were shadowed with exhaustion, but they softened slightly when they landed on her face. You shouldn't be down here. If anything happened tonight, then I'd rather be near you than locked upstairs wondering what was happening, Elena said, the words leaving her before she had fully decided to say them. Dante went very still. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the space between them charged with the same current that had passed through the garden days earlier, stronger now, harder to ignore. He set down his pen slowly, deliberately, like a man forcing himself to move carefully around something fragile. Elena, he said quietly, I need you to understand something. Whatever this is between us, whatever it has become in the last week, I did not intend for it to happen. You did not deserve to be pulled into any of this, and the fact that some part of me is grateful for the mistake that brought you here does not sit easily with me. It doesn't sit easily with me either, Elena admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. None of this makes sense. You kidnapped me. You've kept me locked in a room for over a week. And somehow, when Victor talks about men watching this house, all I can think about is whether you're safe too. Dante rose from behind the desk and crossed the small distance between them, stopping close enough that Elena had to tilt her head back to hold his gaze. That should frighten you, he said softly, far more than anything the Callahans could do. It does, Elena admitted, but not enough to make me leave this room. For a long moment, neither of them moved, caught in a silence that said far more than either of them was ready to put into words. Then, somewhere outside, a car door slammed, and both of them startled apart, the spell breaking as Victor's voice rang out sharp and urgent from the hallway. Boss, you need to see this now. Dante's expression hardened instantly, the careful vulnerability from moments before locking away behind the composed, dangerous man Elena had first met in this very room. He strode toward the door, then paused, glancing back at her. Stay here, he said. Lock the door behind me. Elena did as he asked, her hands trembling as she turned the bolt, her heart still racing from everything that had passed between them only seconds before danger arrived to interrupt it. Through the heavy wood, she could hear raised voices, urgent footsteps, the sound of a house bracing itself for something Elena could not see, but could feel gathering in the air like a storm about to break. Whatever the Callahans were planning, it was no longer a distant threat gathering outside gates and watching from parked cars. It had arrived. Elena pressed her ear to the door, straining to catch fragments of the conversation happening somewhere down the hall. She could hear Victor's voice, tight and clipped, and Dante's answering in short, hard sentences that gave nothing away. A phone rang somewhere in the house. Footsteps moved fast across the floor below, more of them than usual, boots instead of the softer shoes the household staff wore. Minutes stretched into what felt like an hour, though when Elena finally glanced at the clock on the wall, barely 20 had passed. She paced the length of the room, arms wrapped around herself, replaying every word Dante had spoken to her, only minutes before Victor's interruption, wondering if she would even get the chance to hear the rest of what he might have said. When the lock finally turned again, Elena spun toward the door so fast she nearly lost her balance. Dante stepped inside, and the moment she saw his face, tight and pale beneath his usual composure, she knew whatever news Victor had brought was not good. "What happened?" she asked immediately. "The Callahans released a statement to a local reporter," Dante said, closing the door behind him. "They are claiming to have information about your whereabouts. Careful information. Enough to make it credible without giving away enough to actually help anyone find you. It puts pressure on the police to act, and it puts pressure on me to make a mistake in response." "What kind of mistake?" "The kind where I retaliate visibly enough that it justifies everything they have been telling other families about me," Dante said, dragging a hand through his hair, the exhaustion in the gesture more telling than anything he had said aloud all week. "They want a war they can point to and say, 'Look, we told you he was reckless. Look what he does when he is cornered.'" Elena sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, trying to absorb the shape of the trap closing around them both. "So what do you do instead?" "I don't know yet," Dante admitted, and the honesty in his voice struck her harder than any confident reassurance could have. "Victor wants me to move you, somewhere further from the city, somewhere the Callahans have no eyes and no informants. I am inclined to agree with him, even though I do not like the idea of putting more distance between us right now." Something in the way he said it, quiet and almost reluctant, made Elena's chest tighten. "You don't like the idea," she repeated, "because it's dangerous, or because—" "Both," Dante said simply, meeting her eyes without hesitation. "I would be lying if I said it was only about your safety anymore, Elena. I think we both stopped pretending that hours ago." Elena did not have an answer for that, not one she trusted herself to say aloud without it sounding like more than she was ready to admit. Instead, she asked the question that had been gnawing at her since the moment she overheard Victor's warning through the servants' staircase days earlier. "If they find out how you feel," she said carefully, "what happens then?" Dante's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Elena thought he might deflect the question entirely. Instead, he sat down beside her, close enough that his shoulder nearly brushed hers, and stared at the floor, like the answer cost him something to say. "Then they will believe they have found my weakness," he said. "And men like the Callahans do not hesitate to use a weakness once they find one. It is why I have spent this entire week trying to convince myself that nothing has changed, that you are simply a complication I inherited from my own men's mistake. It has not worked particularly well." "I noticed," Elena said, and the smallest, unexpected smile tugged at the corner of her mouth despite everything. Dante glanced at her, surprised into something that almost looked like a smile of his own, brief and tired, but real. "You have a strange sense of humor for someone in your situation." "It's a coping mechanism," Elena admitted. 12-hour hospital shifts teach you to laugh at the wrong moments, or fall apart completely. I chose laughing." They sat together in the quiet for a moment, the danger gathering outside the walls of the house feeling, for just a breath, further away than it truly was. Then Dante's phone buzzed against the desk across the room, sharp and insistent, and whatever fragile peace had settled between them broke instantly. He crossed the room and answered it, his voice shifting immediately into the clipped, controlled tone Elena recognized as his business voice, the one that gave away nothing to whoever listened on the other end. She watched his shoulders tense as he listened, watched his knuckles whiten slightly around the phone. "Understood," he said finally, and ended the call. What is it? Elena asked, already dreading the answer. The reporter who received the Callahan statement is planning to publish tonight, Dante said, which means by morning, the police will have enough public pressure to open a formal investigation into your disappearance, tied directly to rumors about my organization. I need to get ahead of this before it happens. How? Dante was quiet for a long moment, weighing something Elena could not see. I am going to speak with them directly, he said finally. The Callahans, face to face, before this goes any further. Elena's stomach dropped. That sounds like exactly the kind of thing that gets people hurt. It is a risk, Dante admitted. But the alternative is letting this spiral until neither of us has any control over what happens to you or to this house. I would rather walk into danger on my own terms than wait for it to arrive on someone else's. Then I'm going with you, Elena said, the words surprising even herself with how quickly they came. Absolutely not, Dante said, his voice sharpening instantly. That is the last thing I would allow. You just spent the last 10 minutes telling me how much you've changed since I got here, Elena said, standing to face him directly. Don't pretend you get to make every decision about my safety without me having a say in it. Dante studied her, something complicated moving behind his eyes, frustration, and something softer tangled together. You are the reason this entire situation exists, he said quietly. I will not risk you walking into a room full of people who see you as nothing more than leverage against me. And I won't sit in this room wondering if you're coming back, Elena said, her voice trembling now, though not from fear alone. I already spent one night not knowing where I was or what was happening to me. I'm not doing that again, not for you. The admission hung in the air between them, more honest than either of them had intended it to be. Dante's expression shifted, something unguarded breaking through the careful control he wore like armor, and for a moment, Elena thought he might argue further. Instead, he stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, close enough that the space between them nearly disappeared entirely. I will consider it, he said finally, which was not agreement, but was not refusal either. But whatever happens next, Elena, you need to understand that from this point forward, there is no version of this where you simply walk away untouched by what I am. I need you to be certain that is a risk you are willing to take. Elena held his gaze, steady despite the fear still coiled tight in her chest, and answered without hesitation. I stopped being untouched by any of this the moment your men grabbed me off that street, she said. The only thing left to decide now is what I want to do about it. Outside, beyond the walls of the house, the city carried on, unaware that a war was quietly gathering in the dark, unaware that a nurse who had never asked for any of this now stood at the very center of it, no longer entirely certain she wanted to be anywhere else. Glass shattered somewhere below the bedroom window, and Elena was on her feet before she even registered the sound had woken her. For a moment, she stood frozen in the darkness, heart hammering, listening for whatever had made the noise. Then came a second crash, closer this time, followed by shouting downstairs, sharp and urgent, men's voices overlapping in a chaos that had nothing to do with the disciplined calm the house usually carried, even during tense moments. The door burst open before Elena could reach it herself, and Dante filled the frame, fully dressed despite the late hour, his face carved from stone. Get away from the window, he said, already crossing the room to grab her arm. Now, Elena. What's happening? They're here. His voice was clipped, controlled in the way that told her he was holding back something far more dangerous underneath. Move. He pulled her out into the hallway just as another sound cracked through the house, sharp and unmistakable, even to someone who had never heard it outside of movies. And Elena's blood turned to ice. Somewhere below them, the house had become a battlefield. Dante steered her toward the back staircase, the narrow servants' passage Elena had used days earlier to eavesdrop on a conversation that already felt like it belonged to a different lifetime. His grip on her arm was firm but careful, and even in the chaos, she noticed the way he positioned his body slightly ahead of hers on the stairs, shielding her without seeming to think about it at all. Where are we going? Elena asked, her voice shaking, despite her best efforts to keep it steady. Safe room, below the kitchen. Dante's eyes swept the hallway ahead of them constantly, alert to every shadow, every sound. Victor built it years ago, Reinforced walls, its own ventilation, a door that nothing short of an explosion is getting through. They reached the bottom of the staircase and Dante pulled her sharply to the left, away from a hallway where Elena could see the flicker of movement, dark shapes crossing quickly through slatted light. Another crack of gunfire sounded, closer now, and Elena flinched hard enough that Dante's arm came around her instinctively, pulling her against his side as they moved. "Almost there," he murmured, and Elena clung to the steadiness in his voice, even as her own legs threatened to give out beneath her. They rounded a final corner into the kitchen, and Elena saw the door Dante had described, set flush into the floor near the pantry, nearly invisible unless a person knew exactly where to look. Dante knelt and yanked it open, gesturing for her to climb down the short ladder into the dark space below. She had one foot on the first rung when a shape moved in the doorway behind them. Elena did not have time to scream a warning before the man raised his arm, something metallic catching the low kitchen light, and Dante moved faster than she had ever seen a person move, shoving her hard toward the open hatch, even as he turned to face the threat behind them. She stumbled, caught herself against the ladder, and turned back just in time to see Dante grapple with the intruder, both men crashing into the counter, a struggle that seemed to stretch on forever, though it likely lasted only seconds. A shot rang out, deafening in the enclosed kitchen, and Elena's whole body went cold. For one terrible frozen moment, she thought Dante had fallen. Then she saw him still standing, breathing hard, the other man slumping against the counter before sliding to the floor, and relief crashed through her so violently her knees nearly buckled. But relief lasted only a heartbeat before she saw the dark stain spreading across Dante's sleeve. "You're hurt," she said, scrambling back up out of the hatch instead of down into it, ignoring his sharp protest as she reached for his arm. "I'm fine. Get downstairs, Elena. Now is not the time." "I'm a nurse," Elena snapped, cutting through his objection with a firmness that surprised them both. "Let me look at it, or you'll bleed out arguing with me about it." Something in her tone must have reached him, because he stopped resisting long enough for her to peel back the torn fabric of his sleeve and assess the wound beneath the low kitchen light. It was a graze, deep enough to bleed heavily, but not deep enough to be immediately life-threatening, and Elena's training took over instantly, years of emergency room instinct steadying her shaking hands as she pressed a clean kitchen towel hard against the wound. "We don't have time for this," Dante said through gritted teeth, though he did not pull away from her hands. "We don't have time for you to pass out from blood loss either," Elena shot back, tying the towel tight with quick, practiced movements. "Now, downstairs, both of us." For once, Dante did not argue. He followed her down the ladder into the safe room, pulling the hatch shut behind them and sealing the heavy lock into place, and the chaos above them muffled instantly into distant, muted thuds that felt almost unreal from within the reinforced walls. The room was small, lit by a single bulb, stocked with supplies along one wall and a narrow cot pushed against the other. Elena guided Dante down onto it, checking his makeshift bandage again in the better light, relieved to see the bleeding had already begun to slow. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly, once she was certain he was stable, turned to face him instead of running. "Yes, I did," Dante said, watching her with an intensity that had nothing to do with the pain still evident in the tight lines around his eyes. "There was never a version of tonight where I let anything reach you first." Elena's hands stilled against the bandage, her breath catching at the certainty in his voice. "You could have died. I nearly did several times before tonight, in a life you know very little about," Dante said. "This is not new territory for me, but watching you nearly get hurt because of choices I made, choices that started with a mistake my men never should have made in the first place, that is new. That terrifies me, in a way very little else does anymore." Elena sat back slightly, studying his face in the dim light, searching for any trace of the careful, controlled man she had met on that first terrible night. He was still there, somewhere beneath the exhaustion and the pain, but something had cracked open in him over these past 2 weeks, something raw and honest that he no longer seemed interested in hiding from her. "I was so afraid," she admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "When I heard the shot, I thought—" "I know," Dante said softly, reaching up with his uninjured hand to brush a strand of hair away from her face, the gesture achingly gentle after the violence of the last several minutes. I felt the same fear the moment I heard glass break near your window. I have faced armed men more times than I can count, without feeling anything close to what moved through me tonight, thinking something might happen to you before I reached your door. Elena leaned into his touch without deciding to, her exhaustion and fear, and something far warmer all tangled together, into a single overwhelming need to be close to him, to confirm with her own senses that he was truly there, truly safe, truly hers to worry over. "This is insane," she whispered. "2 weeks ago I didn't know you existed. Now I can't imagine what happens to me if something happens to you." "I know," Dante murmured, his forehead resting gently against hers. "None of this makes sense. And yet here we are." Above them, the muffled sounds of chaos continued, for what felt like hours, though the small clock on the supply shelf told Elena barely 40 minutes had passed before the noise finally settled into an uneasy quiet. Neither of them moved from the narrow cot, Elena keeping steady pressure on his wound, Dante keeping his good arm wrapped around her shoulders, both of them listening for any sign of what waited beyond the sealed hatch above. Finally, 3 sharp knocks echoed against the metal door, followed by Victor's voice, tired, but unmistakably alive. "It's clear, you can come up." Dante exhaled slowly, some of the tension easing from his shoulders, and Elena helped him to his feet, keeping a steadying hand against his good side as they climbed back up into a kitchen transformed by the night's violence. Broken glass littered the floor. A dark stain marked the spot where the intruder had fallen, though his body had already been removed. Victor stood near the doorway, a bruise forming along his jaw, directing a handful of exhausted-looking men in cleaning up what remained of the attack. "2 of theirs got through the outer wall," Victor reported, his voice grim. "We stopped them before they reached the upper floors, but it was closer than I would like. They knew exactly where to hit us. Someone gave them information about this property." Dante's expression darkened. "Find out who." "Already on it," Victor said. Then his gaze flicked to Dante's bandaged arm, concern briefly breaking through his professional composure. "You need a proper doctor to look at that." "She already looked at it," Dante said, nodding toward Elena, and something in the way he said it, simple and certain, made Elena's chest tighten with an emotion she no longer had any interest in denying. Victor studied the 2 of them for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes as understanding settled fully into place. He did not comment on it directly, though his expression carried the weight of a warning neither of them needed spoken aloud. Whatever this had become between them, the danger surrounding it had only grown sharper tonight, not softer. "The Callahans will not stop after one failed attempt," Victor said finally. "If anything, tonight gives them more reason to try again, and more evidence to use against you if word gets out that you nearly died protecting a woman outside the family." "Let them talk," Dante said, his voice hard and certain in a way Elena had not heard since that very first night. "I am done pretending this is only about protecting my organization's reputation. Elena stays under my protection, and anyone who has a problem with that can bring it to me directly." Elena looked at him, this man who had taken her by mistake and refused to let go of her since, standing bloodied and exhausted in a kitchen ruined by violence meant to tear them apart, and felt something settle firmly into place inside her chest. Whatever fear had first driven her toward the servants' staircase, whatever anger had fueled her early attempts to escape, none of it changed the simple, undeniable truth staring back at her now. She did not want to leave this house because Dante Marchetti kept her locked inside it. She wanted to stay because somewhere along the way, without either of them intending it, she had stopped imagining a life that did not include him in it. The house did not sleep again that night. Elena stayed close to Dante as Victor's men worked to secure the broken section of the outer wall, sweeping glass, boarding windows, checking every corner of the property twice over before anyone allowed themselves to relax even slightly. She found herself handing out water, checking a few minor cuts and scrapes among the guards with the same steady competence she brought to any emergency room shift, grateful for something useful to do with her shaking hands. Near dawn, Priya found her in the kitchen, still wearing borrowed clothes stained faintly with Dante's blood, and pulled her into a brief, fierce hug that startled them both. "I'm glad you're all right," Priya said, pulling back with her eyes suspiciously bright. When I heard the shots, I thought. She stopped herself, shaking her head. It doesn't matter now. You're safe. He's safe. That's what matters. You care about him, Elena said, something in Priya's reaction sparking a question she had not thought to ask before. I've worked in this house since before his mother passed, Priya said quietly. I watched him grow up carrying more weight than any child should have to carry. He does not let many people close, Elena. Whatever he feels for you, I have not seen him feel it for anyone else in all the years I have known him. The words settled deep in Elena's chest, and she was still turning them over when Dante found her an hour later. His arm freshly bandaged by an actual doctor, Victor had brought quietly through a side entrance. His color better than it had been in the safe room, but exhaustion still carved deep beneath his eyes. You should rest, she told him, echoing the words he had said to her so many times over the past 2 weeks. I will, once I know how they got through the wall, Dante said, though he sank into the chair across from her at the kitchen table anyway, some unspoken concession to her insistence. Victor is questioning the staff now. Someone gave them the layout of the property, the location of the safe room, the patrol schedule. That kind of information does not leave this house by accident. You think someone here betrayed you, Elena said. I think someone here betrayed all of us, Dante corrected, his eyes flicking briefly toward her before returning to the table. You included. Whoever gave the Callahans that information knew exactly where you slept, Elena. That was not a coincidence. A cold weight settled in Elena's stomach. She thought of the guards who rotated through her hallway, the staff who brought her meals, the dozens of quiet, ordinary interactions she had taken for granted, as simply part of her captivity, never once considering that one of those familiar faces might be working against the very safety Dante had promised her. Who would do that, she asked. Who would risk everything to help them get to you? Money, Dante said simply, or fear. The Callahans are not gentle with people who refuse to cooperate, and they pay well for those who do. It could be either, and until Victor finishes questioning everyone, I intend to trust no one outside this room. The admission, quiet and matter-of-fact, struck Elena harder than she expected. 2 weeks ago, she had been a stranger dragged into a world of danger and suspicion against her will. Now she sat across from the man at the center of that world, one of only 2 people in the entire house he claimed to trust completely, and the weight of that trust settled over her like something both precious and terrifying. What happens now, she asked, if they find whoever did this? They answer for it, Dante said, his voice going hard in a way that reminded Elena, briefly and sharply, exactly what kind of world she had fallen into. And then we prepare for the Callahans to try again, because men like them do not stop after one failure. They regroup, they wait for the next opening. Will there be one? Dante was quiet for a long moment, studying her across the table, with an expression that mixed exhaustion with something far more tender underneath it. Not if I have anything to do with it, he said finally. I have spent the last 2 weeks trying to convince myself I could protect you without letting you matter too much to me. Tonight made it very clear that plan failed a long time ago, and I no longer see the point in pretending otherwise. Elena reached across the table and covered his good hand with hers, feeling the tension in his fingers slowly ease beneath her touch. Then stop pretending, she said softly. I already told you, back in the study, I'm not interested in a version of this where you keep me at arm's length to protect some idea of what's safe for both of us. Whatever this is, I want it honest. Dante turned his hand beneath hers, lacing their fingers together, and for the first time since the chaos of the attack had torn through the house, something like peace settled over the space between them. Then honestly, he said quietly, I do not know how this ends, Elena. I do not know if I can promise you safety, or a normal life, or any of the things a woman like you deserves, but I know I am done pretending I want anything other than you standing beside me while I figure it out. Outside, the first gray light of morning began creeping over the garden where his mother's roses grew wild and untended, and Elena sat with her hand in his, no longer thinking of locked doors or armed guards, thinking instead of how strange and unstoppable it was that danger had brought her closer to this man, instead of driving her away from him entirely. The Callahans were not finished. Neither, Elena realized with a certainty that surprised her, was she. Victor found the traitor 2 days later, and the news he brought upstairs made Elena's stomach turn cold before he had even finished speaking. It was Carlo, Victor said, standing rigid in the doorway of the study, his expression carved from stone. The guard who was supposed to be watching Elena's door that first week. The Callahans approached him after the escape attempt, offered him enough money to disappear somewhere far from this life. He gave them the property layout, the patrol rotation, the location of the safe room, everything they needed. Elena felt sick, remembering the nervous young guard who had let her slip past him, the same guard who had blushed and stammered his apologies afterward. She had felt sorry for him at the time, had almost liked him despite everything. "Where is he now?" Dante asked, his voice flat and controlled in a way that told Elena he was holding something back, something dangerous. "Gone," Victor said. "He must have realized we were closing in. His room was cleared out this morning." Dante's jaw tightened, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, staring at some point on the wall, as though he could see straight through it, to whatever plans the Callahans were already setting into motion with Carlo's help. "Then they know everything," Elena said quietly. "Everything about this house. About me." "Yes," Dante admitted, "which means staying here any longer is no longer the safest option for either of us." Elena's heart sank. "You're sending me away." "I am moving both of us," Dante corrected, meeting her eyes with a steadiness that eased some of her fear even as the words themselves unsettled her further. "There is a property upstate, isolated, harder to reach, known only to a handful of people I trust completely. We leave within the hour." The drive north took nearly 3 hours, winding through increasingly rural roads until the city lights disappeared entirely behind them, replaced by dark forests and open fields lit only by a pale, watchful moon. Elena sat close to Dante in the back seat, his good arm around her shoulders, watching the world blur past the window and trying not to think too hard about what waited for them at the end of the road, or what might be following behind them in the darkness. The safe house, when they finally arrived, was smaller than the estate they had left behind, tucked into a clearing surrounded by dense trees, guarded by only a handful of men Dante clearly trusted without question. Inside, the rooms were simple but warm, and for the first time since the cloth bag had come down over her head weeks earlier, Elena found herself in a space that did not feel like a cage at all. "We should be safe here for now," Dante said, watching her take in the modest living room, the small kitchen, the window that looked out over dark trees instead of a guarded stone wall. "The Callahans do not know this location exists." "For now," Elena repeated, catching the uncertainty beneath his words. "I will not lie to you," Dante said. "This is not over. Carlo knows enough about my organization to cause serious damage if the Callahans decide to use him publicly instead of quietly. I expect they will try something soon, before the trail goes cold." Elena crossed the room and sat down beside him on the worn sofa, exhaustion from the drive and the danger and the weeks of fear finally catching up with her all at once. "Then what do we do?" "We wait," Dante said. "And we prepare. Victor is working on a way to discredit whatever story Carlo sells them, evidence that shows exactly how far the Callahans have gone, to manufacture a war out of an honest mistake. If we can get ahead of the narrative before it reaches the wrong ears, we might end this without further bloodshed." "And if that doesn't work?" Dante was quiet for a moment, his expression grim. "Then I do whatever is necessary to keep you safe, regardless of the cost." The days that followed settled into a strange, fragile rhythm. Elena helped Priya, who had come north with them, prepare simple meals in the small kitchen. She spent afternoons reading in the modest garden behind the house, guarded at a respectful distance by men who no longer looked at her like a problem to be managed, but like someone worth protecting in her own right. In the evenings, she and Dante sat together on the porch, watching the sun disappear behind the tree line, talking about everything and nothing, filling the space between them with pieces of themselves neither had shared with anyone in years. It was on the 5th evening, as the sky turned deep orange over the trees, that Victor arrived with news that shattered the fragile peace they had built. "Carlo surfaced," Victor said, breathless from the drive, his expression grave. "The Callahans are planning to hand him over to the police tomorrow morning. along with a fabricated story claiming Elena has been held against her will this entire time under threat of violence. They intend to make certain the story reaches every news outlet in the city before anyone has a chance to correct it. That's not entirely fabricated, Elena said quietly, though there was no accusation in her voice anymore, only a tired kind of honesty. It was true, once. It was, Dante agreed, meeting her eyes steadily. And it is not true anymore, and I intend to make certain the truth reaches the same audience the Callahans are trying to manipulate. How? Elena asked. Dante was quiet for a long moment, and Elena watched something settle behind his eyes, a decision finally reached after days of careful calculation. I go to the police myself, he said, before Carlo does. I tell them the truth, all of it, the mistake my men made, the choice I made to keep you close afterward, everything. I let you confirm whatever parts of the story you are willing to confirm, and I accept whatever consequences come from admitting what happened. Elena's breath caught. That could destroy everything you've built, everything your father built. It could, Dante said simply. Or it could be the only thing that saves both of us from a story the Callahans control, instead of one we tell honestly ourselves. You'd really do that, Elena said, searching his face for any trace of hesitation, and finding none. Risk everything, just to make sure the truth gets told the right way? I would do far more than that for you, Dante said, and the quiet certainty in his voice left no room for doubt. The following morning, Elena stood beside Dante in a small, unremarkable police station, 3 towns away from the city, watching him speak calmly and honestly to a detective who had clearly expected a very different kind of conversation. Elena confirmed the parts of the story that were hers to confirm, careful and measured, watching relief and confusion move across the detective's face in equal measure as the truth unfolded in a way far more complicated than any headline could have captured. By the time they left the station hours later, the story had already begun shifting, quietly but unmistakably, away from the narrative the Callahans had tried so carefully to construct. Carlo's testimony, when it finally surfaced that afternoon, arrived too late to control a story that had already found its own more complicated, more human shape. The Callahans did not disappear entirely. Consequences, both legal and otherwise, unfolded slowly over the following weeks. Negotiations Elena understood only in careful fragments Dante shared with her when he judged it safe to do so. But the immediate danger, the sharp, violent threat that had followed them from the city to the quiet house among the trees, finally began to ease into something more manageable, something that no longer kept Elena awake through every long night listening for footsteps outside her door. Months later, Elena stood in the garden behind the original estate, watching Dante kneel among his mother's roses, finally tended properly for the first time in years, his hands careful and patient with the thorny stems, in a way that still surprised her every time she watched him do it. You didn't have to do this yourself, she said, settling onto the stone bench nearby. You could have hired someone. I wanted to, Dante said, not looking up from his work. My mother used to say, a garden reflects the person who tends it. I let this one go wild for a long time. I'm trying to do better. Elena smiled, watching sunlight catch in his dark hair, remembering the frightened, furious woman who had once stood in this same garden, convinced she would never feel anything but fear toward the man now kneeling patiently among his mother's flowers. So much had changed since that first terrifying night, more than she ever could have imagined possible when a cloth bag came down over her head on an ordinary walk to her car. I used to think about what would have happened if your men had grabbed the right woman that night, Elena admitted. If everything had gone exactly according to plan. Dante looked up at her, something warm and unguarded moving across his face. I think about that too sometimes, and I am endlessly selfishly grateful they got it wrong. Elena laughed, the sound easy and unguarded in a way it had not been for a very long time. Wrong girl, she said softly, echoing words he had spoken that very first night, though they carried an entirely different weight now. Wrong girl, Dante agreed, rising from among the roses and crossing the garden to sit beside her, his hand finding hers with the easy familiarity of countless quiet evenings shared since that terrible, transformative first meeting. But I meant what I said back then, even before I understood exactly why I meant it. I was never going to let you go. Elena leaned into him, watching the last of the evening light settle golden over the garden his mother had once loved, and understood, with a certainty that no longer frightened her at all, that whatever mistake had brought them together, she had no interest whatsoever in undoing it now. She was exactly where she wanted to be, kept not as a prisoner, but as a choice she had made herself, again and again, every single day since that very first terrifying night. And for the first time in her life, being kept felt like nothing short of coming home. Later that evening, Victor arrived with papers for Dante to sign, some final piece of the long, quiet negotiation that had settled the last of the tension between the two families. He found them still sitting in the garden, and something in his expression softened as he took in the sight of them together, easy and unguarded in a way he had rarely seen from his old friend. "The Callahans have agreed to the terms," Victor said, handing over the folder. "Formal acknowledgement that the initial claims against you were fabricated, along with an agreement to stay out of your territory going forward. It's over, Dante. All of it." Dante scanned the papers briefly before setting them aside, his attention already drifting back to Elena beside him. "Good," he said simply. "Thank you, Victor, for everything these past months." Victor nodded, then glanced at Elena with something warmer than the cautious suspicion he had first regarded her with weeks ago. "For what it's worth," he said, "I was wrong to worry so much about what you might cost this family. You have been good for him, better than I expected." "I praise," Elena said, smiling, "from a man who once told me I was the most dangerous complication he'd seen in a decade." "I stand by that assessment," Victor said, a rare, dry smile tugging at his mouth. "You simply turned out to be a complication worth keeping." He left them alone again, the folder of papers tucked under his arm, and Elena turned to find Dante watching her with an expression she had come to know well over the past months, equal parts affection and quiet disbelief that any of this had truly become his life. "You know," she said, leaning her head against his shoulder as the last light faded from the garden, "Maddie still doesn't fully believe this story when I tell it. Wrong woman, wrong car, wrong night, and somehow it turned into this." "Do you believe it?" Dante asked quietly. Elena considered the question honestly, thinking back over every frightened night in that locked upstairs room, every quiet conversation that had slowly worn away her fear and replaced it with something she never could have predicted. "I believe every hard part of it," she said finally. "The fear, the danger, the uncertainty. I lived through all of that, and I won't pretend it wasn't real. But I also believe this part, right here, just as much. Maybe even more." Dante pressed a kiss to the top of her head, his arm tightening around her shoulders, as the first stars began appearing over the dark line of trees at the edge of the property. "Then that is the only part of the story that matters now," he said. "Everything else was simply the price we paid to get here." They stayed in the garden long after the sky had gone fully dark, unhurried and unafraid. The danger that had once shadowed every corner of their lives finally settled into something distant and manageable, a story they would tell in careful pieces for years to come. Elena thought of the woman she had been on that ordinary night, walking to her car after a long shift, tired and thinking of nothing more complicated than dinner, and marveled quietly at how completely that entire life had transformed into this one. Not the life she had planned, not the life anyone would have chosen, given the choice at the very beginning. But it was hers now, chosen freely and fiercely despite everything that had tried to keep her from it. And as Dante's hand tightened around hers beneath a sky full of slowly emerging stars, Elena understood with complete and settled certainty that she would not trade a single terrifying, transformative moment of it for the ordinary life she had once been living instead. The wrong woman had found exactly the right place to belong,